Hi everyone, welcome to this section. We'll be doing brain, brainstem, and the blood supply to the brain. Firstly, let us look at some of the main lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. So here I have two models which we use in the dry lab at the university. So this panel here has got the lateral view of the cerebral cortex. This panel here has got the medial view of the cerebral cortex. From the lateral view, we are able to view the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. From the medial view, we are able to view one additional lobe here, which is the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe lies at the most posterior aspect of the cerebral cortex. Also, it is noteworthy that you'll be able to view cerebellum, which is located inferior to the occipital lobe. Coming back to the lateral view here, the lobes of the brain are divided by sulcuses. So here you can see a lot of infoldings of the cerebral cortex. If you remember the development of the cerebral cortex and have watched the video, you will be able to recall that the cerebral cortex grows as an outgrowth from the rostral end of the neural tube. So as it grows into a large cerebral cortex, and in order to accommodate itself into the cranial cavity, it undergoes extensive infoldings. So the upper parts are called the gyruses, which are elevated parts, and the depression that is formed are called the sulcuses. So you can see a lot of sulcuses and gyruses here. In this region, we'll be able to see a partition. This is called the central sulcus here. The central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And on this region here, in the lateralmost aspect, we have got the lateral sulcus, which separates the frontal and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. So this lobe here is the temporal lobe. The sulcus that divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe here is known as the parieto-occipital sulcus. The parieto-occipital sulcus runs across like this between the parietal and the occipital lobe. Here you are seeing the posterior view, and from the posterior view of the cerebral cortex, you can now clearly see the occipital lobes and the cerebellum that is located inferior to the occipital lobes. Inferior to the cerebellum, you'll see a part of the medulla, which is a part of the brainstem. This is the superior view of the cerebral cortex. Here you can see a longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure separates the right and the left cerebral hemisphere, and this runs in the middle, and both the cerebral hemisphere, even though they are separated by the longitudinal fissure, they are connected to each other by a bundle of white matter, which is known as the corpus callosum. Also, from the superior view, you will be now able to view the central sulcus very clearly. You can see the central sulcus here. And the gyrus that lies in front of the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus. And the gyrus that lies behind the central sulcus is known as the postcentral gyrus. Now, the precentral gyrus is also known as the primary motor cortex, and the postcentral gyrus on both the sides are also known as primary somatosensory cortex. Here I have taken the medial view of the brain model to basically show you the parieto-occipital sulcus, separating the parietal and the occipital lobe here. Also here from the medial view, you can see this bundle of white matter, which basically connects the right and the left cerebral hemisphere. And this bundle here is known as the corpus callosum. This image shows you the distribution of the gray and the white matter. As you can see, the outermost part of the cerebral cortex is the gray matter, and the inner part is basically the white matter. In this view, you can see the white matter here, which connects the two cerebral hemispheres together. This being the longitudinal fissure that we earlier saw from the superior view. And this bundle of white matter connecting both the cerebral hemisphere is known as the corpus callosum. This part here is known as the corona radiata. And down here you'll have the white matter, which is basically connecting the cerebral cortex to the lower parts of the body, which is the internal capsule here in this region. So in the cerebral cortex, we can see the outer part is the gray matter. And please note the gray matter is nothing but the cell body or the cell bodies. And the white matter is basically the nerve fibers or the axons, which basically carries the nerve impulses. Those are the white matter. With an understanding of the gray and the white matter of the brain, now you should be able to identify or differentiate certain gray matters and white matters within this section here. For example, this is the basal nucleus here. You should be able to now identify whether this is the gray matter or an example of white matter. We have the internal capsule in this region. Whether it is an example of white matter or the gray matter. Let us now look at some functional areas of the brain. In order to do the functional areas of the brain, let us now look at some functional areas of the brain. In order to do this, let us first divide the cerebral hemisphere into different lobes. In order to divide the cerebral hemisphere into lobes, it is important that we identify the sulcus, the main sulcus that serves as a major landmark to identifying the lobes. Let us first draw the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus that divides the cerebral hemisphere into the frontal and the parietal lobes. Then let us draw the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. And of course, we have the occipital lobe in this region. Let us look at some functional areas that we might be interested in. You would also want to look at the detailed function of each of these functional areas. The gyrus that lies immediately in front of the central sulcus is known as the primary motor cortex. It is also known as precentral gyrus. So it's preceding the central sulcus, so immediately lying in front of the central sulcus, which is the precentral gyrus. And the gyrus that lies immediately posterior to the central sulcus is known as the primary somatosensory cortex, or also the post-central gyrus. The other functional areas that we would be really interested in is the Broca's area. So the Broca's area is also known as the motor speech area, which is located here in this region. This area is primarily associated with production of speech. So if there is a damage to this particular area of the cerebral hemisphere, the person will be able to understand the words but not be able to put it in a meaningful language or produce it as a speech. On the temporal lobe here, we have the superior temporal gyrus. And just on the medial aspect of the superior temporal gyrus, we would have the primary auditory cortex. So a bit of the primary auditory cortex you would be able to see in this region here approximately. But majority of the primary auditory cortex is visible on the medial aspect. So if you split open this lateral sulcus and the frontal and the parietal lobe, if you split it apart, you'll be able to view the primary auditory cortex there. We then have the supramarginal cortex around this region. The supramarginal cortex just lies posterior to the lateral sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus. Just posterior to the lateral sulcus, you'll find the supramarginal cortex. And posterior to the supramarginal cortex, you'll see the angular gyrus. The supramarginal cortex and the angular gyrus are believed to perform complex perpetual discrimination and integration related functions. So these are the main functional area that we would want you to know. And then you have the cerebellum here. The cerebellum is responsible for coordination of movements. Let us now look at the anterior and the posterior surface of the brainstem. So the brainstem are mainly comprised of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So this one here, panel A is posterior view, panel B is anterior view. So here you will have the midbrain, pons, and the medulla. Major features on the anterior aspect of the midbrain, you will be seeing the cerebral peduncles. So cerebral peduncles are nerve fiber tracts that connects the cerebral hemisphere to the brainstem. So it basically connects the midbrain, pons, and the medulla to the cerebral hemisphere. And then we have the pons, and this is the base of the pons. And in the middle, you'll see a slight groove or a depression. This is also known as the basilar groove. And in this groove, you will find the basilar artery lies on this basilar groove, which is located on the pons. And then we have the medulla, which is the lowermost aspect or the caudal aspect of the brainstem. And in the center, you'll find the two bumps or elevation, which are also known as the pyramids. So these pyramids have got the fibers of corticospinal tract. We'll do a lot more detail about the corticospinal tract when we are doing the motor pathways. But for now, you just need to know that this landmark here is known as the pyramid, which is located on the medulla. Looking at the posterior aspect, one main features that we would want to appreciate here is the superior and the inferior colliculus. So the superior colliculus is mostly associated with receiving the visual input, and the inferior colliculus is responsible for receiving the auditory input. So this is basically the midbrain, and this is the pons and the medulla. Here we have the inferior view of the brain. So from the inferior view, this is what you will be able to actually see. If you flip the brain, you will be able to see the lower aspect of the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, part of the cerebellum here. Of course, you will be in an intact brain, you'll be able to see both the lobes of the cerebellum. You'll also see the cranial nerves that are emerging on the base of the brain or the inferior aspect of the brain. So there are 12 cranial nerves, as you would already know. I have listed them for you here. As a rule of thumb, the origin of these nerves are 2, 2, 4, 4. So the first 2 cranial nerve emerges from the brain. Here we can clearly see the olfactory and the optic emerging from the brain. And the next 2 emerges from the midbrain, which is the oculomotor and the trochlea. And the trigeminal, abducent, facial, vestibulocochlear, they emerge from the pons. The glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve, they emerge from the medulla. Here we have the schematic representation of the circle of Willis, which you would have seen in most of the textbooks and your online videos. Anterior cerebral artery here. Both the anterior cerebral arteries communicate with each other through the anterior communicating arteries. And the internal carotid artery also gives out a tiny branch, which is the posterior communicating artery, which communicates with the posterior cerebral artery. Coming posteriorly, you have the 2 vertebral arteries here, which branches off the subclavian artery and enters into the vertebral canal via the transverse foramen at the 6th cervical vertebrae. And at the base of the pons, they unite to form the basilar artery and then gives off the posterior cerebral artery, which gives blood to the posterior part of the brain, including the occipital lobe and the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. For your subject, we are not too concerned about the smaller branches such as the pontine branches. These are the tiny pontine branches. We are really interested in the big branches that we just mentioned. This is an MRI showing the ventricles of the brain. So if you remember from the ventricular system that you would have gone through the online videos, the ventricles usually circulates the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus, which are located in the brain. The main function of the cerebrospinal fluid is to provide cushioning to the surface of the brain, prevent the brain from any sort of trauma, also prevents the brain cells from having a traction against the harder surface of the cranial cavity. So in this region here, we are looking at 2 lateral ventricles, which then move the cerebrospinal fluid. Once it's produced by the choroid plexus, it basically from the lateral ventricle it enters into the 3rd ventricle here, and from the 3rd ventricle it goes down to the 4th ventricle. From the 4th ventricle it goes into the dural venous sinuses via the arachnoid villi. You need to know for your pracs the lateral ventricles, its opening, what are the openings called. So the 2 lateral ventricles open into the 3rd ventricle via the interventricular foramen. And from the 3rd ventricle it opens into the 4th ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. So these are the things you need to focus on with regards to the cerebrospinal fluid and the ventricles. This is a diagram from the study manual, page 109. With all the information that I've just provided, you should now be able to label the sulcuses that you can identify on these diagrams in your book, and also the lobes of the brain. So we have the lateral and the medial view here. And I think you should have a go at labeling anything that you can identify in these image. Not only the lobes and sulcuses, there are other features as well, so you need to label those as well. So this is also an image from your book, study manual, page 101. You have the lateral and the medial surfaces. I want you to have a go at shading in the area of blood supply to the lateral and the medial surfaces of the brain. So for example, you're looking at the lateral surface here. Have a think about what is the branch or the major blood supply to this region, and try to shade in appropriately, and try to use the same color coding for both medial and the lateral view.